understand the way they measure it. So a lot of households that are not within this definition say, well, we're middle class. And a lot of households within this definition saying, well, we're not middle class. So there's a huge discrepancy. Okay. So what we decided to do was to look at U.S. Department of Commerce definition, and they did a huge study that was about 2012 under Obama administration, and it was commissioned by the White House, and they identified the 6 indicators. They said, well, if you're middle class, if you achieve home ownership, vehicle ownership, have a car, and health insurance, and so have some security there, and you can take 1 vacation per year, and you have the ability to send your children to college, and you have adequate retirement savings. So that's what they identified, okay? And so what we decided to use these, to look at these indicators, and these indicators are results of consumption behavior over time, and income, of course, as well. So when we analyze this, the angle we're looking at is, well, okay, so your middle class status really is determined by your consumption behavior, which then in turn is determined by preferences, and that would include cultural and demographics, and constraints, your income over time, your wealth, and all that. And the gap may be explained by differences in preferences, and that is cultural. They spend money differently, for example, and they have different family situations. And it can also be explained by constraints, lower income, or even non-economic constraints such as market discrimination. These are all possibilities, right? So our hypothesis to these 3 questions I raised earlier were, first, Hispanics have lower proportions achieving all indicators of middle class status, but the disparity is different for different indicators. So it's not all even in terms of these different indicators. And second is demographic and socioeconomic factors contribute to these differences. And, but structural differences, that means how they react to different things differently, may exist as well. And third questions, we assume there's no change over time because we don't really know, so it's a null hypothesis, what we call it. So no change of time over time. So the data we used for research questions 1 and 2, we used 2009 to 2016 consumer expenditure survey data called CEX. And 2016 is the most recent year that the data are available. And for research question number 3 is to see whether there's time trend. We went back to 2003 to look at pre-recession, during the Great Recession, and post-recession to see if there are changes. Okay, so these are some details about CEX data. Then you can find that online as well. And sample size, we had at the end 3,633 Hispanic households and a little over 20,000 white households. Okay. So we used, remember the 6 indicators? Saving for college versus saving for retirement, we couldn't really tell the difference. So we modified things a little bit. We looked at home ownership, vehicle ownership, health insurance, vacation. But the last question, we combined them to look at savings to cover at least 1 month expenditures, so they're not living on a sort of paycheck by paycheck kind of situation. Okay. And then we also looked at 3 composite measures. We look at whether they're meeting 3 out of 5 indicators, 4 out of 5, and 5 out of 5, because like if you live in San Francisco downtown, you probably don't want to have a car anyways, and you could still be middle class. So you don't necessarily have to meet all these 5. And if you're early in your life cycle, you may not have home ownership, but you have achieved a lot of other things. So that's why we look at these composite measures and not necessarily meeting all 5. Okay. So here, some basic results, and these are not new. We know all these. Hispanic households tend to be younger. They have larger family size. About the same % married households, so that's about even. And they're less educated. And, but they have about the same percentage employed. They're less likely to be retired, more likely to be not working, not employed. But the percentage of the employed population about the same. They have lower total household expenditures. more likely to live in the South than West, and more likely to live in large metropolitan areas. Okay, so that's a general stuff. So here are our results, like first result, what the current situation. 8 indicators, 5 individual indicators, and 3 composite indicators. And these numbers, first, well, that's a second column for Hispanics, proportion, attaining home ownership, vehicle ownership. And this is for white households, this column. And this is the gap in percentage. Okay. So I'm not going to read all these numbers. Take a look, and do you have any questions? And you can see it's all lower on every indicator, but depending on the indicator, like vehicle ownership, the difference is pretty small. It's less than 10%. But in terms of savings, that whether they have enough saving to cover 1 month expenditure, the difference is very big, 64.5%. And the achievement rate is actually very low for both types of households. Okay, so these are the descriptive numbers, okay? And then we looked at research question 2. We said, well, okay, what are the contributors to these indicators or achieving these indicators? And these are just some statistical details as to what method we used. But I want to give you some highlights. Older age. So these are the positive factors for multiple indicators. If you're older, you're married, college educated, you have higher total expenditure, you're living in the Midwest as opposed to live, the reference category is Northeast. So Midwest, you're more likely to achieve these middle class status indicators, and you live in smaller metropolitan areas. Okay, so these are in general positive factors. Negative factors, not working if you don't speak English. Okay, so language barrier. There are some exceptions, like older age, instead of achieving all these, you're less likely to take vacation, and you probably can guess why, right? If you're older, you're less probably mobile. College educated actually have lower vehicle ownership. That was kind of a little bit of a surprise, but they are less likely to own vehicles. Not employed actually have higher insurance coverage compared to employed. And that's likely because of Medicaid, some of these social programs. And there are some mixed relationships here. There are some differences, what I call structural differences. That is, the relationship between these factors and middle class achievement can be different for Hispanics compared to whites. The main factors, association with age and is smaller for home ownership for Hispanics. So age doesn't seem to matter as much for Hispanics than for whites. And not having a high school education is more disadvantageous for Hispanics than for whites. Okay. Benefits for retirement is larger. So if you're Hispanics and you're retired, somehow you're much better off compared to whites with the same relationship. Okay. Not working is not as bad. And I said it that way because not working compared to working for Hispanics, it's not a huge difference, but for whites, there's a huge difference. Okay, and not speaking English, again, is not as bad because in the white household population, we also have some households where immigrants who don't speak English. But it seems like the situation is a lot worse for them compared to Hispanics not speaking English. So that's another difference. And regional advantages or disadvantages are bigger, somehow amplified for Hispanics compared to white households. Like if you live in the Midwest, you're better off compared to Northeast. But for Hispanics, it's especially so. So it's like the coefficient is a lot larger, okay? And again, smaller metropolitan area size, more advantageous with the exception of really, really small towns. For some reason, if they live in really, really small, I would say probably farming communities, then they're not better off. But in other places, smaller metropolitan areas are great. No difference, gender. There's no difference between Hispanics versus white households. If you have some college versus high school, again, there's no ethnic difference, structural differences, okay? So what we did, we did a simulation Okay, so we observe structural differences, but then we say, well, what if these Hispanic households were behaving or facing the constraints and preferences like the whites? Do we see adjustment up or down, like if they behave that way, or if they face the same market constraints? So here, these are the numbers you have already seen. These are the actual numbers. These are what we call the adjusted numbers. So suppose they do things and face the market constraints like whites. Are they better off? Are they worse off? And you can see in every category, there is somewhat an improvement. So you kind of can say it could be their cultural, it could be the constraints they face, but they would be a little bit better off if it's adjusted this way. But you can see the improvement is not huge. This is the numbers for whites. You still see a huge gap. So there's a slight gain when adjusted, and the largest gain is in health insurance and savings. And I would guess part of it is because whether you're eligible for government-sponsored health insurance or not. That probably makes a difference there. Okay. So remember, question number 3 was, well, has the gap widened or narrowed over time, right? So with that, we went back to pre-recession, 2003 data. So we divided data into pre-recession, during recession, and post-recession. And you can see these are the composite measures. The green is meeting 3 out of 5, red is meeting 4 out of 5, and blue is meeting 5 out of 5. And so you compare these two lines, and this is Hispanics and this is whites. And again, this red compared to red, although they kind of overlap, but the blue compared to blue. Hispanics, you can see that the gap is about the same over time, but in general, there's a downward trend. And you can see that during recession, it's lower, but actually, as far as we know, using these indicators, middle class has not recovered post-recession. Even in 2016 data has not recovered. So it's slightly lower, and these are all statistically significant. So the conclusion, reviewing back to these 3 questions, yes, there's a gap on all indicators. And however, the gap is different for different indicators. And individual indicators, savings, widest gap, vehicle ownership, smallest gap. To question number 2, we have both structural difference and differences caused by demographic and socioeconomic differences. But the difference due to structure was small. You can see when we adjusted, it's still a large gap. It's a little bit better. And number 3 is overall decline of middle class over time for both groups. And gap has not significantly widened or narrowed pre-recession, looking at 2003 to now. So that's the conclusion. Okay. Couple of limitations. One major limitation of defining middle class this way is there's no upper ceiling, because this actually includes people who, Bill Gates might be here, because as long as you achieve all these 5, or 4, you're in here. And that includes the upper class, and which makes the picture even less pretty, because even if you include the upper class, you still see a downward trend over time. Okay. So that's one limitation in terms of defining middle class. And there might be ways to tweak that, and we'll probably look at that down the road. But in terms of future research, what we want to do is we need to compare those objective indicators with the income-only definition of middle class that the popular press or Pew Research Center uses to see, how different is that? Is there a good match, or is that, just a large discrepancy? And then, especially for the Hispanic population, I think it will be interesting because of the immigrants, of course, when they first come in, they tend to have much lower education, lower attainment. Maybe to separate the immigrants from the non-immigrants and to see if for people who have been here for a long time, whether the situation is different. And that would be an interesting question to look at. So the question is whether I have any quotes. I think one important conclusion of this paper is that middle class is declining, however you look at it. There are many different ways of looking at it, and this is definitely declining. Second is the conclusion that Hispanics over time, or the gap has not narrowed or widened over time. Yeah. That, I think, well, the question is whether the gap is going to continue to remain the same. I personally think it does depend a lot on the immigration situation. I think if we look at the population, the older immigrants or the older generations, I think they do move up. But whenever you have new immigrants coming in and you look at the population as a whole, the gap is probably not going to narrow over time because it kind of averages out in that sense. Yeah, so it will take a while, and it will depend on the immigration situation in the US. That's very, well, first, economic inequality has increased over time in the US. But this study doesn't necessarily look at that because if you get richer and richer, we don't consider that a bad thing, right? So it's the upper part. I think the general structure of the U.S. economy is putting, or in the world actually, because we rely more and more on human capital, return is higher and higher, and so people who are not educated tend to fall further and further behind. So that's probably a main reason. Globalization is definitely in the U.S. situation contributed to that gap as well, because the lower end jobs tend to disappear, or they pay less and less if they face more of a world sort of global competition, and that gets complex. So there are a lot of factors, but the general structure of the economy definitely contributes to that. Yeah, that's a very interesting question, because in a different paper, we looked at every 4 years of data, and about, I think, 2-3 years. We have to combine years because we don't have that many Hispanics in the data. And if we don't combine years, you're looking at 200 households, and that's not representative. So that's the main reason. But we also looked at every 4 years, look at whether things correspond to political environment. And we looked at from 1980, I think, all the way to 2016. We did not see a clear correlation with the political environment with this data and with these particular measures. Yeah, statistically about the same. So they kind of parallelly going down. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and we found that to be true for Asian American households as well. Black households were a little different. It was just going, we didn't see a clear pattern. It was going like a little like this instead of just straight down. And we haven't finished looking at that data yet, so I can't give a conclusion, but it was a little different. Because, well, we first wanted, well, first this data set has a limitation, is we don't really know who is first generation, second generation. So what we did was a proxy, whether they used language that's not English for their interview. So we kind of figured that if you're first generation, you're more likely to be speaking Spanish and not understanding you're less likely to use English and more likely to use Spanish. But this is a proxy. So we wanted to look at the general picture first before getting more into details. So here we do control for the interview language, whether they speak Spanish or not in their English or not in their interview. But we haven't done the separate analysis yet. So let's get a general picture first. That is likely the case. Cost of living somewhat lower. And also, I think Hispanics who live in Midwest might be somewhat different from Hispanics who live in the South and West. So there are characteristics differences as well that's not fully adjusted.
Characteristics you come across to notice?
We haven't done a stratified study, but what I know is I think their educational level somewhat higher in the Midwest, Hispanics who live there. Also, they are more likely to be not new immigrants. They're more likely to be second or third generation. But that's just more anecdotal because we haven't done a fully developed study yet. But these are what I kind of see from the descriptive level. Yeah, but don't quote me on that because I can't. So when we do the full study, maybe it would be different, but that's my impression. This is the Consumer Expenditure Survey is a government data set published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So you can actually get on the BLS website, just type in Consumer Expenditure Survey, and you can download all the data and with codebook and everything. And if you're interested in that, I can give you the link. Yeah, definitely. It's all there. From 1980 continuously to now. And they collect data every quarter on about 5,000 US households. And they interview them for a whole year and get their very detailed expenditure patterns. We're using, some of them using shopping receipts so they can remember this is how much money I spent on this and this. It's very, very detailed, very interesting actually. Yes, and if you're working with, say, for example, a Hispanic household, and to be sensitive to their cultural, their preferences, as you can see here, when I say structural differences, that will reflect they may be facing a different borrowing market, for example. They may have family situations, they have larger family size. They may have family situations that are very different from white households or from your own ethnicity, for example, and be sensitive to their needs and their preferences and develop, say, for example, a financial planning plan that will work well for them instead of for the general population. So these are certainly all linked together at the end. Well, the younger certainly are less likely to achieve middle class the way we're measuring it, home ownership and all these things. But I pointed out earlier, for some reason, Hispanics are more likely to invest in housing. So age doesn't make as much of a difference for Hispanics as for white households. Larger family size is a very interesting variable because it tends to increase home ownership and vehicle ownership, but tend to be negatively associated with all these other things. So they spend a lot of money on housing and on buying cars, but take less vacation, less likely to health insurance coverage, and have less savings. So family sizes wasn't, yeah, we didn't find major structural differences in terms of family size. It seems to work about the same for Hispanic households and white households. So in general, larger family size are negatively associated with the composite indicators, but are positively associated with the first two, the home ownership and vehicle ownership, but negatively associated with the other three indicators. But overall, it's a negative for both groups.